The sterile, fluorescent lights of John F. Kennedy International Airport usually illuminate nothing more than the mundane routines of exhausted travelers. But on a brisk Tuesday morning at Terminal 4, those lights cast a harsh, unforgiving glare on a colossal mistake. When a smug TSA officer decided to publicly humiliate a quiet black teenager over what he assumed was a counterfeit passport, he believed he was cementing his authority. He laughed, waving the document around like a cheap carnival prize, completely unaware of the invisible tripwire he had just crossed. He didn't know the boy wasn't just another tourist, and that cruel laugh would be his last as a free man. Minutes later, the FBI swarmed the checkpoint. The sprawling expanse of JFK's Terminal 4 was a chaotic symphony of rolling luggage, frantic announcements, and the dull, collective murmur of thousands of passengers desperate to reach their gates. It was 8:15 a.m., the peak of the morning rush, and Security Checkpoint Charlie was backed up all the way to the sliding glass doors of the departure drop-off. Standing behind the elevated blue podium at the document checking station was Transportation Security Officer Richard Gable. Richard, known to his colleagues simply as Rick, was a man who wore his meager authority like a heavy iron-forged crown. 12 years on the job had not brought him a promotion, nor had it brought him peace. Instead, the repetitive nature of his work had curdled into a bitter, resentful complex. He had watched countless junior officers, including his current supervisor, Brenda Hayes, climb the ranks while he remained stationed at the front line, scanning boarding passes and matching faces to IDs. Rick had convinced himself that the system was rigged against him, and he compensated for this perceived injustice by exercising absolute, unrelenting dominance over the one domain he controlled: the line of passengers waiting to pass through his podium. Rick had a specific talent for profiling, though not the kind taught in federal training seminars. He profiled for weakness. He looked for the nervous, the rushed, the young, and the unfamiliar. He reveled in the small delays, asking a flustered mother to dig out her toddler's birth certificate, intensely questioning an elderly man about his knee brace, or scrutinizing the driver's license of a college student for agonizing minutes. A few feet away, Officer Brenda Hayes adjusted the bins on the X-ray belt, occasionally shooting a wary glance toward Rick's podium. She knew Rick's tendencies. She had written him up twice for unnecessary delays and aggressive posturing, but union protections and a persistent shortage of personnel meant Rick stayed exactly where he was. Brenda sighed, focusing on the monitor, hoping the morning would pass without an incident. Further down the winding labyrinth of the standard security queue stood a young man who seemed entirely out of place amidst the stressed business executives and frazzled families. 19-year-old David Sterling stood with a quiet, grounded stillness that defied the chaotic environment. He was a young black man dressed in an unassuming gray hooded sweatshirt, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. Slung casually over his right shoulder was a weathered, heavy-duty black canvas duffel bag that looked like it had seen its fair share of rough handling. Despite his youthful appearance, there was a startling intensity in David's eyes. He didn't tap his foot, he didn't check his phone every 10 seconds, and he didn't sigh heavily when the line grounded to a halt. He simply waited, observing the room with the detached precision of someone who was constantly aware of their surroundings. As the line inched forward, Rick Gable's eyes locked onto David. In Rick's cynical mind, the narrative wrote itself. He saw a young kid in a hoodie, traveling alone, carrying a nondescript bag, looking entirely too calm. To Rick, calm equated to insolence. Calm meant the kid didn't respect the authority of the uniform standing behind the podium. Rick adjusted his posture, puffing out his chest beneath his ill-fitting blue shirt, and waited. Next, Rick barked, his voice carrying a sharp, abrasive edge that made a nearby passenger flinch. David stepped out of the queue and walked up to the podium. He didn't offer a nervous smile or a rushed greeting. He simply stood squarely in front of Rick, his expression neutral, his posture perfectly straight. "Boarding pass and ID," Rick demanded, not looking at David's face but staring pointedly at the young man's chest. "I don't have a boarding pass, officer," David replied. His voice was smooth even and possessed a baritone depth that momentarily caught Rick off guard. "I'm flying out of a private charter at Gate 81, but I was instructed to process through the standard federal checkpoint. Rick's eyes snapped up, narrowing into suspicious slits. Gate 81 was at the far end of the terminal, often reserved for high-net-worth individuals, diplomatic flights, or overflow from the private aviation fixed-base operators. The idea that this kid in a cheap gray hoodie was heading anywhere near a private charter struck Rick as not just unlikely, but deeply offensive. It challenged his entire worldview of how things were supposed to work. "No boarding pass, huh?" Rick sneered, leaning heavily against the podium. "You think you can just walk through a federal security checkpoint because you've got a cool story? This isn't a bus station, kid. ID. Now. And it better be good." David didn't react to the provocation. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into the inner breast pocket of his hoodie. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely lacking the panicked fumbling Rick usually enjoyed watching. David withdrew a small dark booklet and slid it across the stainless steel surface of the podium. Rick looked down at the document. It was a passport, but it wasn't the standard dark blue tourist passport he saw thousands of times a day. It wasn't the maroon official passport, nor was it the standard black diplomatic passport. It was a matte, jet-black cover, completely devoid of the usual glossy finish. In the center, stamped in a muted, reflective silver foil, was the Great Seal of the United States. But beneath the seal, instead of the words passport, there was a string of alphanumeric codes and the bold block letters, Department of Defense, Special Courier Credentoil. Rick stared at the booklet. His mind, conditioned by years of routine and a stark lack of high-level clearance training, drew an immediate and disastrous conclusion. Rick Gable let out a sharp, derisive snort that echoed loudly over the din of the checkpoint. He picked up the black booklet, holding it between his thumb and index finger as if it were contaminated. He flipped it open. The pages inside didn't have the usual colorful patriotic watermarks of eagles and national monuments. Instead, they were embedded with complex, shifting holographic micro-threads and a rigid polycarbonate data page that looked more like a high-tech military access card than a passport. "What is this garbage?" Rick asked, his voice rising in volume, intentionally projecting so the passengers waiting in line behind David could hear. "It is exactly what it says it is, Officer Gable," David replied calmly, reading the man's name tag. "It is a valid, federally issued credential. I suggest you scan the machine-readable zone at the bottom of the data page." "You suggest?" Rick barked, his face flushing a deep shade of crimson. He looked around, catching the eye of a businessman in a suit, was watching the exchange. Rick offered the man a knowing, mocking grin. "Hey, get a load of this guy. He thinks I'm an idiot." Rick turned his attention back to David, slapping the black passport onto the podium. "Listen to me, you little punk. I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've seen every fake ID, every novelty passport, every sovereign citizen piece of laminated cardboard you can imagine. Did you buy this off the internet? What? Do you think stamping Department of Defense on a piece of black leather makes you James Bond?" "Officer," David said, his voice dropping slightly in register, taking on an authoritative tone that sent a strange, cold shiver down Brenda Hayes' spine from 20 feet away. "That document is federal property. It is highly sensitive. You are currently mishandling it. Scan the barcode, confirm my identity, and let me proceed." "You are making a mistake." The word mistake was the match that ignited Rick's fragile ego. The idea that this teenager was lecturing him on protocol in his own territory was entirely unacceptable. "I'll show you a mistake," Rick sneered. He grabbed the passport again, and with a blatant display of disrespect, he bent the rigid polycarbonate data page backward, testing its flexibility. David's jaw tightened infinitesimally, the only physical sign that he was anything other than a statue. "Do not damage that document. If you break the embedded RFID chip, it will trigger an automated security protocol." Rick laughed a loud, booming, ugly sound that cut through the ambient noise of Terminal 4. "An automated security protocol. Oh, we've got a comedian. What's gonna happen, kid? Are the Navy SEALs gonna drop through the ceiling?" Rick held the passport high in the air, turning to the growing crowd. "Attention, everyone. The line is going to be delayed for a few minutes. We've got a highly dangerous special courier here who tried to pass a fake passport he printed in his mom's basement. A few people in the line chuckled nervously, but most just looked annoyed at the delay. Brenda Hayes abandoned the X-ray belt and began walking briskly toward the podium. "Rick, what is going on? Just run the ID through the scanner." "Back off, Brenda. I've got this," Rick snapped. He looked back at David, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "You're done, kid. Attempting to bypass federal security with a fraudulent document is a felony. You're not going to Gate 81. You're going to a holding cell." Rick slammed the passport down onto the glass surface of the document scanner. He didn't do it to verify the identity. He did it to formally log the confiscation of a fraudulent document into the TSA database, a necessary step before calling the Port Authority police to make an arrest. He pressed the document firmly against the glass and hit the scan button on his console. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. The standard green checkmark that usually appeared on Rick's screen did not materialize. Instead, the screen flickered, went completely black, and then a bright, pulsing crimson banner appeared across the monitor. There was no photo, no name, no flight information. There was only a single line of stark white text. "Code all black, level 1, clearance required. Hold subject in place. Do not alert subject." Rick frowned, tapping the screen with a thick finger. He hadn't seen this specific error message before, but he assumed it was just the system rejecting the complex barcode of the fake ID. Ignorant to the gravity of the silent alarm he had just triggered, Rick reached under the podium and pressed the red detention button, signaling for the roving checkpoint supervisors to escort a hostile passenger to the secure holding room. "All right, hotshot," Rick said, coming around the side of the podium and pointing a finger squarely at David's chest. "You're coming with me. Grab your little bag." David didn't move. He looked down at the scanning terminal, noting the red reflection on Rick's uniform shirt. A small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped his lips. "You scanned it," David stated quietly. "You're damn right I scanned it, and the machine flagged it as garbage. Now move." David slowly reached down and picked up his black canvas duffel bag. He didn't resist as 2 heavily built TSA supervisors, summoned by Rick's button, approached him from behind. "Take him to interrogation room B," Rick ordered, puffing his chest out. "I'll be there in a minute to write up the incident report. Port Authority is going to have a field day with this kid." As the supervisors flanked David and began to walk him away from the public eye, David turned his head back. He looked directly at Rick Gable. There was no anger in the boy's eyes, no fear, no panic. There was only a profound, chilling pity. "You had a choice, Officer Gable," David said, his voice carrying clearly over the distance. "I hope you have a good lawyer." Rick scoffed, waving him off and returning to his podium, thoroughly satisfied with his morning's work. He picked up his coffee cup, taking a triumphant sip, completely unaware of the digital shockwave currently racing through secure fiber-optic lines. 15 miles away, inside the Jacob K. Javits Federal Building in Manhattan, the Secure Operations Center of the FBI's New York field office suddenly erupted into organized chaos. A klaxon alarm began to sound, a tone reserved exclusively for the compromise of high-level national security assets. Special Agent Thomas Caldwell, a veteran of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, stared at his main monitor. The GPS coordinates tied to the biometric chip of a Tier 1 defense intelligence courier had just triggered a distress beacon from a civilian TSA scanner at JFK Terminal 4. The asset was carrying physical data drives classified above top secret, drives that contained encrypted troop movements for an allied nation. Caldwell grabbed his radio. "All units, we have a code black at JFK Terminal 4. Checkpoint Charlie. A Tier 1 courier has been illegally detained. The asset is potentially compromised. Scramble the regional response team. I want tactical on the ground in 5 minutes. Lock down the entire terminal." Back at the airport, Rick Gable adjusted his belt, feeling like the king of the castle. He called the next passenger forward, eager to flex his authority once again. He had exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds of freedom left. Interrogation Room B was a claustrophobic, windowless cinderblock square tucked behind the main X-ray conveyor belts of Checkpoint Charlie. The air inside smelled faintly of stale floor wax and metallic anxiety, illuminated by a single harsh fluorescent tube that hummed with a persistent, irritating buzz. In the center of the room sat a scratched aluminum table bolted directly to the linoleum floor, flanked by two rigid plastic chairs. David Sterling sat in the chair furthest from the door. He had not been handcuffed. The TSA supervisors who escorted him lacked the legal authority to do so without Port Authority police present, but they had firmly instructed him to stay put. He sat with his spine perfectly straight, his breathing slow and measured. His heavy black canvas duffel bag rested squarely on his lap. He kept both hands resting lightly on the reinforced nylon straps. The heavy steel door swung open with a sharp clatter, rebounding slightly off the wall. Rick Gables strutted into the room, holding a plastic clipboard like a weapon. He kicked the door shut behind him with his heel, the boom echoing loudly in the small space. He pulled out the opposite chair, turning it around so he could straddle it backward, resting his forearms on the backrest. He wore a predatory, satisfied grin. "All right, Mr. D. Sterling, or whatever your real name is," Rick began, clicking his pen with an obnoxious snap. "You got about 5 minutes before the Port Authority police get here to slap the bracelets on you. I'm going to do you a favor. You tell me exactly where you got that fake badge, who printed it, and what you're actually doing trying to sneak onto a private charter flight, and maybe I'll tell the cops you cooperated. Otherwise, you're looking at federal forgery charges. That's 5 to 10 years in Leavenworth, kid." David didn't blink. His expression remained an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. "Officer Gable, I have already informed you of my status. I am a Tier 1 courier operating under the Department of Defense. You have unlawfully confiscated my credential, and you are currently delaying a time-sensitive, highly classified transit. I strongly advise you to retrieve my credential, process me through the checkpoint, and allow me to proceed to Gate 81. Rick let out a harsh bark of laughter, shaking his head. "You are fully committed to the bit, aren't you? Department of Defense. Right, and I'm the Director of Homeland Security. You think using big words is going to scare me? I deal with sovereign citizen nut jobs every week." "You're nothing special." Rick stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He leaned over the aluminum table, his face inches from David's. "Let's see what's so important in the bag, James Bond." Rick reached out, his thick, calloused hands grabbing the top handle of the black duffel bag. With a speed that defied the casual posture he had maintained, David's left hand snapped up. His fingers locked around Rick's wrist with the unyielding grip of an industrial vice. David didn't pull or twist. He simply stopped Rick's momentum dead. The sudden, immovable resistance shocked Rick, freezing him in place. "Remove your hand from this bag, officer," David said. His voice had dropped to a glacial, terrifying octave. There was no threat in his tone, only an absolute biological certainty. "This container is secured under DoD Instruction 5200.33. It contains materials classified above top secret. Opening it without biometric clearance from the intended recipient will trigger an incendiary thermal protocol that will destroy the contents and severely burn anyone within a 3-foot radius. Furthermore, your attempt to access it constitutes espionage." Rick yanked his arm back, his face flushing with a volatile mix of embarrassment and explosive anger. He took a step back, pointing a trembling finger at David. "You just assaulted a federal officer. You put your hands on me. That's it. You're done. You are going to federal prison for the rest of your miserable life." Before Rick could lunge forward again, the heavy steel door was thrown open. Brenda Hayes stood in the doorway, her face pale and shining with cold sweat. Behind her stood Port Authority Police Department, PAPD, Sergeant Michael O'Connor, a 20-year veteran of airport security. "Rick, step away from him," Brenda ordered, her voice shaking noticeably. "Brenda, this animal just assaulted me," Rick shouted, turning to the PAPD sergeant. "Sergeant O'Connor, I want this kid in cuffs right now. He's carrying a forged federal document. He's threatening a terrorist attack with an incendiary device in that bag, and he just physically attacked me." Sergeant O'Connor didn't look at Rick. His eyes were locked on David, taking in the kid's impossibly calm demeanor, the specific make of the duffel bag, and the way David was sitting. O'Connor had served 2 tours in Fallujah as a Marine before joining the police force. He recognized the posture. He recognized the dead-eyed, predatory stillness of a highly trained operative. "Officer Gable," Sergeant O'Connor said slowly, his hand resting cautiously on his duty belt. "Your supervisor just showed me the error screen on your terminal. The entire TSA network at Checkpoint Charlie just locked out. It's displaying a Level 1 national security override. I called my precinct captain to run the kid's name." "And?" Rick demanded, feeling a sudden inexplicable cold sweat prickle at the base of his neck. "He's a ghost, right? A terrorist." "My captain couldn't access the file," O'Connor replied, his voice grim. The second he punched the name in, the terminal froze, and he got a direct phone call from the Pentagon. Not the regional office, the actual Pentagon. "They told us to stand down, secure the perimeter, and wait for the feds. I am not touching this kid, and neither are you." "Are you kidding me?" Rick exploded, his ego blinding him to the flashing neon warning signs surrounding him. "It's a cyber attack. He probably has a hacker buddy messing with our systems. I'm taking that bag to the X-ray right now." Rick lunged toward David again, entirely unhinged by the insubordination of his colleagues and the defiance of the teenager. "Rick, don't!" Brenda screamed. David merely braced his feet against the floor, preparing to physically neutralize the threat to his cargo. But before Rick could lay a finger on the canvas material, the concussive, deafening roar of a heavy tactical breach echoed through the terminal outside. The morning commute on the Van Wyck Expressway had been violently interrupted 10 minutes earlier. 4 unmarked, armored Chevrolet Suburbans, their hidden grille lights flashing a blinding strobe of red and blue, had blown past the traffic gridlock on the shoulder, doing 80 miles an hour. They careened up the departure ramp of Terminal 4, the heavy tires squealing in protest as they slammed to a halt directly in front of the sliding glass doors of the terminal. Before the vehicles had even come to a complete stop, the doors flew open. 12 heavily armed operators from the FBI's Elite Hostage Rescue Team, HRT, attached to the New York Joint Terrorism Task Force, poured out onto the pavement. They were clad in full olive-drab tactical gear, Kevlar helmets, and level RV plate carriers. They carried short-barreled M4 carbines equipped with holographic sights and tactical flashlights. Leading the charge was Special Agent Thomas Caldwell. He didn't wear a helmet, but his FBI windbreaker over his ballistic vest clearly identified his authority. "Move, move, move! Secure the perimeter!" "Nobody leaves the terminal," Caldwell roared into his radio, sprinting through the automatic doors. The sprawling departure hall of Terminal 4 descended into instantaneous screaming chaos. Hundreds of passengers, seeing heavily armed men sprinting into the building, dropped their luggage and scattered in blind panic. Mothers pulled their children to the ground. Businessmen dove behind check-in counters. "Federal agents, get down! Clear the area!" The tactical operators bellowed, their voices cutting through the shrieking alarms that had begun to blare overhead. Caldwell bypassed the screaming crowds, his eyes locked on the blue signage of Checkpoint Charlie. He signaled with 2 fingers, and a wedge of 5 SWAT operators formed tightly around him as they sprinted toward the security line. At the checkpoint, TSA agents were frozen in terror, holding their hands in the air. Passengers in the security line had dropped to the floor, covering their heads. Caldwell vaulted over the first set of stanchions, his boot slamming heavily onto the tile. "Who is in charge here?" Caldwell yelled, his voice echoing over the chaotic din. Brenda Hayes, who had just stepped out of Interrogation Room B at the sound of the commotion, raised a trembling hand. "I'm the supervisor on duty." Caldwell closed the distance in 3 long strides, his eyes fierce. "Where is the subject who triggered the terminal scan? Where is the courier?" Brenda pointed a shaking finger back toward the heavy steel door of Interrogation Room B. "In there, with Officer Gable." Inside the windowless room, the muffled screams and the heavy thud of tactical boots vibrating through the floorboards caused Rick Gable to freeze mid-lunge. He looked at the door, then back at David. A wide, triumphant smile spread across Rick's face. He let out a loud, victorious laugh. "Hear that, kid? Rick sneered, smoothing down his uniform shirt and adjusting his belt. That's the sound of your life ending. I told you I wasn't messing around. They brought the tactical teams out for you. You really stirred up a hornet's nest with this fake ID stunt. Panic. David looked at Rick, his expression a mixture of profound exhaustion and genuine pity. Officer Gable, I strongly suggest you put your hands above your head and drop to your knees. Shut up, Rick spat. I'm going to walk out there, hand you over to the feds, and I'm going to get a medal for stopping a terrorist today. Rick turned his back on David, marched confidently toward the heavy steel door, and pulled it open. He stepped out into the hallway, expecting to be greeted by bewildered local cops looking for a suspect. Instead, the moment his foot crossed the threshold, the world exploded into blinding light and deafening noise. 5 intense, blinding white, surefire flashlight beams hit Rick squarely in the face, completely washing out his vision. Before he could even raise a hand to shield his eyes, 5 red laser dots materialized on his chest, hovering directly over his heart. Hands! Let me see your hands! Do it now, a voice roared with the concussive force of a bomb blast. Rick gasped, his heart slamming against his ribs. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced his ego. He threw his hands into the air, dropping his plastic clipboard. It shattered against the linoleum. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm TSA. I'm the officer who caught him. Rick screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. He squinted against the blinding lights, pointing frantically back into the interrogation room. He's in there, the guy with the fake passport. I've got him secured. Special Agent Caldwell stepped forward, violently shoving Rick's pointing arm down. With a swift, practiced motion, Caldwell grabbed Rick by the collar of his uniform shirt, spun him around, and slammed him face first against the cinder block wall of the hallway. The breath left Rick's lungs in a pathetic whoosh. What are you doing? Rick shrieked, his cheek pressed agonizingly against the rough concrete. I'm a federal officer. I'm the good guy. Caldwell didn't answer. He kept his forearm pressed firmly against the back of Rick's neck, holding him in place while he peered cautiously into interrogation room B. David Sterling was still sitting in the plastic chair. His hands were still resting calmly on the black canvas duffel bag. He looked up at the heavily armed FBI agent. Courier Sterling? Caldwell asked, his tone instantly shifting from aggressive command to respectful inquiry. Special Agent Thomas Caldwell, FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. Are you secure, son? I am secure, Agent Caldwell, David replied, his voice steady and calm. The asset is intact. The integrity of the cargo has not been breached. Caldwell let out a heavy sigh of relief. He looked back at the TSA officer pinned beneath his arm. Rick's eyes were wide with a terror he had never known, his mind violently struggling to comprehend the reality that was currently destroying his life. However, David continued, standing up smoothly and slinging the heavy bag over his shoulder, this officer confiscated highly classified Department of Defense credentials, attempted to forcibly access a Level 1 secure container, physically threatened a federal courier, and intentionally delayed a critical national security transit. Caldwell leaned closer to Rick's ear, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Is that right, Officer Gable? I didn't know. Rick sobbed, his bravado entirely evaporated, replaced by the whining tears of a broken bully. I thought it was a fake. He's just a kid. He's wearing a hoodie, you thought, Caldwell said coldly. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Your job is to scan the IDs, Gable, not to play God. Caldwell violently wrenched Rick's arms behind his back, the loud metallic ratcheting sound of the handcuffs clicking tightly around Rick's wrists echoed down the hallway, a sound that signaled the absolute end of his career, his freedom, and his arrogance. Richard Gable, Caldwell stated formally, his voice carrying over the silence of the stunned checkpoint. You are under arrest for violation of the Espionage Act, interfering with a federal officer, and reckless endangerment of national security assets. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it. The silence that had fallen over Checkpoint Charlie was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy tread of tactical boots and the ragged, panicked breathing of Richard Gable. The sprawling sea of passengers, previously annoyed by the delay and then terrified by the sudden breach, now watched in stunned fascination. Hundreds of smartphones were raised, their camera lenses focused squarely on the man in the blue TSA uniform who was currently being walked out of his own domain. Rick's face was drained of all color, replacing his usual ruddy, arrogant complexion with a sickly ash-gray pallor. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit painfully into his wrists, pinning his arms awkwardly behind his back. Every step he took felt like wading through wet concrete. He looked desperately at the faces in the crowd, searching for a sympathetic eye, perhaps a fellow officer who would step in and stop this madness. But he found none. He saw passengers whispering, pointing, and shaking their heads. He saw his supervisor, Brenda Hayes, standing near the X-ray belt, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, refusing to even look in his direction. "Keep moving, Gable," Special Agent Caldwell commanded quietly, his grip on Rick's bicep unyielding, steering him past the very podium where Rick had, just 20 minutes prior, felt like a god among men. The irony was suffocating. He was being paraded through Terminal 4 not as a protector of the skies, but as a hostile threat to the United States government. As Rick was escorted out the sliding glass doors and shoved roughly into the back of a black, armored Chevrolet Suburban, David Sterling remained inside the terminal. The heavy canvas duffel bag was slung securely over his shoulder. The remaining FBI tactical operators had formed a loose, protective perimeter around him, keeping the gawking public at bay. Agent Caldwell re-entered the terminal, adjusting his windbreaker. He walked straight up to David, his demeanor shifting entirely. The aggressive, barking federal agent was gone, replaced by a composed, highly deferential professional. "Courier Sterling, my apologies for the delay and the unpleasantness," Caldwell said, his voice low enough that only David could hear. "The perimeter is secure. I have a tactical element ready to escort you directly to the tarmac at Gate 81. Your pilots have been updated on the situation. The delay has cost us 32 minutes, but Flight Command in D.C. 1-Thash says you have a tailwind over the Atlantic that should make up the time." "Thank you, Agent Caldwell," David replied. His voice remained as smooth and unbothered as it had been when Rick Gable was screaming in his face. "The escort won't be necessary. Just clear the corridor. Drawing further attention compromises the operational footprint." Caldwell nodded respectfully. "Understood." "Safe travels, son." David turned and walked away. He bypassed the entire winding security maze, stepping through a side door held open by a heavily armed SWAT officer. Within minutes, the chaotic noise of the main terminal faded away, replaced by the hushed, deeply carpeted silence of the private aviation wing. Gate 81 wasn't a standard departure lounge. It was an exclusive fixed-base operator terminal, smelling of rich leather and fresh espresso. Out on the rain-slick tarmac sat a sleek, matte gray Gulfstream 650ER. It bore no tail number visible to the naked eye, and its windows were heavily tinted. Two men in dark suits stood at the base of the air stairs, earpieces spiraled into their collars. As David approached, they parted seamlessly, offering sharp, subtle nods of acknowledgement. David climbed the stairs and entered the cabin. The interior was stripped of the usual luxury appointments found in billionaire charters. Instead, it was a mobile command center, bolted with server racks, secure communication arrays, and the reinforced titanium safe welded directly to the airframe. A silver-haired man in a crisp white shirt emerged from the cockpit. "We're wheels up in 3 minutes, David. You gave D.C. quite a scare." The biometric fail-safe on your bag tripped an espionage wire at the Pentagon when that idiot put his hands on it. David walked to the back of the cabin, placed the black canvas bag inside the titanium safe, and pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner. A heavy mechanical lock engaged with a loud, satisfying thunk. "The asset is secure, Captain," David said, taking a seat and strapping himself into the heavy 5-point harness. He looked out the window, watching the flashing lights of the police cruisers far off in the distance, near the main terminal. "Just another Tuesday in New York. Let's get this to Ramstein." Oh. As the Gulfstream's massive Rolls-Royce engines whined to life, propelling the aircraft down the runway and into the overcast sky, David closed his eyes. He had a job to do, but miles below him, a man who had let a badge and a brutal prejudice dictate his actions was about to find out exactly how heavy the hand of the federal government could be. The holding cell deep within the bowels of the Jacob K. Javits Federal Building was a masterclass in psychological discomfort. It was freezing cold, illuminated by a single caged bulb that cast long, harsh shadows against the concrete walls. There were no windows, no clocks, and no sounds other than the faint rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. Richard Gable sat on a rigid metal bench, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He had been sitting there for exactly 4 hours, though to him it felt like 4 lifetimes. The adrenaline that had spiked during his dramatic arrest had long since crashed, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing pit of dread in his stomach. Every time he closed his eyes, he replayed the morning's events. He remembered the black teenager in the gray hoodie. He remembered the feeling of absolute certainty he possessed, the arrogant belief that he had caught a criminal, that he was smarter than the kid, smarter than the system. He remembered laughing, bending the black passport backward, mocking the boy for printing it in a basement. Department of Defense. Special courier credential. The words echoed in his mind, no longer a source of amusement, but a terrifying death knell for his future. He had confiscated the highest level of security clearance known to the United States military, shoved the courier into an interrogation room, and threatened him with prison. The heavy steel door of the holding cell unlocked with a loud metallic clatter. Rick jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. 2 men entered the room. The first was Special Agent Caldwell, his face a stony mask of pure contempt. The second was a man Rick didn't recognize at all, painfully thin man in a sharply tailored, expensive navy suit. He carried a thick manila folder and a sleek silver laptop. "Sit down, Gable," Caldwell barked, though Rick was already seated. The command was simply a reminder of who held the power. The man in the suit pulled out a metal folding chair, sitting directly across from Rick. He opened the laptop, typing briefly, before turning his cold, dead eyes to the disgraced TSA officer. "My name is Bradley Harrison," the man said, his voice quiet, clipped, and devoid of any emotion. "I am a senior prosecutor with the National Security Division of the Department of Justice. Do you understand who I am, Mr. Gable?" Rick swallowed hard, his throat feeling like sandpaper. "Yes, sir." "Good," Harrison said, opening the manila folder. "Let me explain your current reality to you, because I don't believe you fully grasped the gravity of the cliff you just walked off. 4 hours ago, you intercepted a Tier 1 defense intelligence courier. That courier was transporting encrypted hard drives containing the finalized troop movements and logistical supply chain schedules for a joint NATO operation currently deploying in Eastern Europe." Rick felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. Harrison pulled a glossy photograph from the folder and slid it across the table. It was a still frame from the checkpoint security camera. It showed Rick laughing, holding the black passport high in the air for the crowd to see. "You didn't just delay a flight, Mr. Gable. You publicly broadcasted a secure credential. Furthermore," Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "you physically attempted to breach a Class A secured container. When you put your hands on that canvas bag in the interrogation room, the pressure sensors recorded your fingerprints. You triggered an automated espionage protocol. The Pentagon assumed the asset was actively being stolen by a hostile foreign agent." "I didn't know," Rick finally choked out, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. "I thought he was just some punk. He was wearing a hoodie. He looked like—" Rick stopped himself, but the silence hung in the air, heavy and condemning. "He looked like what, Rick?" Caldwell interjected, leaning against the cinder-block wall. "He looked like someone who shouldn't have access to a private jet. He looked like someone you could bully without consequence. Your implicit bias is not a legal defense against treason." "Treason?" Rick shrieked, bolting upright. "You can't be serious. I'm a TSA officer. I made a mistake. Call my union representative." "I want my union rep." Harrison didn't blink. He slowly closed the manila folder. "Your union representative, a Mr. Paulson, was briefed 30 minutes ago. The moment he saw the letters DoD and Espionage Act, he formally withdrew union support. They are terminating your employment as of noon today, effectively immediately with cause. You have no pension. You have no medical benefits. You have no union lawyer. Rick's legs gave out. He collapsed back onto the metal bench, the air rushing from his lungs as if he had been punched in the gut. The safety net he had relied on for 12 years, the union that had protected him through countless complaints of harassment and bullying, had vanished in an instant. Brenda Hayes, Harrison added smoothly, your immediate supervisor, has already provided a sworn deposition detailing your history of racial profiling, aggressive behavior, and your specific refusal to run the passport through the scanner properly before attempting to flex your authority. You are entirely alone, Mr. Gable. What is going to happen to me? Rick whispered, a tear finally spilling over his eyelashes and tracing a hot, humiliating path down his cheek. You are being charged under Title 18 U.S. Code, Section 793 gathering, transmitting or losing defense information, Harrison recited flawlessly, as if ordering from a menu, coupled with assault on a federal operative and reckless endangerment. The DOJ is seeking 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. No parole. You will be held without bail, as you are currently deemed a severe national security risk. Harrison stood up, smoothing his tie. He picked up his laptop and the manila folder. He looked down at the broken, sobbing man on the bench. You thought you were the biggest man in the room today, Mr. Gable, Harrison said, his tone finally betraying a hint of dark satisfaction. You thought you could humiliate a young man simply because you didn't like the look of him. Instead, you picked a fight with the United States military, and you lost everything. Welcome to the real world. Agent Caldwell opened the heavy steel door, allowing the DOJ prosecutor to step out into the hallway. Caldwell looked back at Rick one last time. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply grabbed the heavy handle and slammed the door shut. The loud metallic boom echoed off the concrete walls, followed by the definitive heavy click of the lock engaging. Inside the freezing, windowless room, Richard Gable was left entirely alone with the deafening silence, drowning in the catastrophic consequences of his own arrogance. The Matt Gree Gulfstream 65V touched down on the rain-swept tarmac of Ramstein Air Base in Germany, exactly 7 hours and 12 minutes after departing New York. As the aircraft taxied toward a heavily guarded, restricted hangar, the sheer scale of the operation David Sterling was a part of became undeniably clear. Flashing amber lights guided the jet into the cavernous structure, where a fully armed detachment of United States Air Force security forces was already waiting, forming a formidable wall of ballistic vests and M4 rifles. David unbuckled his 5-point harness, retrieved the heavy black canvas duffel bag from the titanium airframe safe, and walked down the air stairs. Waiting for him at the bottom was Lieutenant General Arthur Collins, the Deputy Commander of U.S. European Command. The general's face was etched with a grim, tight-lipped tension that had nothing to do with the weather. "Courier Sterling," General Collins said, returning David's crisp salute before extending a hand. "Let's get that drive to the SIF. We are operating on a razor's edge here." As they walked rapidly toward the secure briefing room, Collins outlined the terrifying reality of the 32-minute delay Richard Gable had caused at JFK. The data you are carrying contains the randomized extraction coordinates for a deep-cover CIA operative currently embedded in a hostile sector near the Ukrainian border, General Collins explained, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. That operative's cover was blown this morning. We had a narrow satellite uplink window to transmit these secure coordinates to the extraction team. Because of the delay in New York, we missed the primary window by 4 minutes. David's normally impassive face tightened. What is the status of the operative, General? He had to break cover and engage hostile forces to survive until the secondary window opened, Collins replied coldly. He took 2 rounds to the vest and 1 to the shoulder. He is currently bleeding out in a medevac chopper over the Black Sea. He will live, but it was a near-fatal disaster, all because some petty tyrant in a blue shirt wanted to flex his ego at an airport checkpoint. Oh, that was the twist. the brutal real-world consequence that Rick Gable could never have comprehended while he was laughing and waving a passport in the air. His prejudice and his desperate need to feel powerful hadn't just caused a bureaucratic headache. It had nearly cost an American hero his life in a mud-soaked trench 4,000 miles away. This devastating detail was the primary reason the Department of Justice showed absolutely no mercy. 9 months later, the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse in Lower Manhattan served as the stage for the final act of Richard Gable's spectacular downfall. The courtroom was packed. Press reporters, federal agents, and even a few of Rick's former TSA colleagues sat in the gallery, watching in absolute silence. Rick sat at the defense table, looking like a withered husk of the man who had once terrorized Checkpoint Charlie. He was wearing a shapeless, standard-issue khaki jumpsuit from the Metropolitan Correctional Center. His hair had thinned dramatically, and his skin was a sickly pale gray. He looked small, terrified, and profoundly broken. His defense attorney, a weary public defender named Sarah Jenkins, had tried valiantly to secure a plea deal, arguing that Rick was simply an undertrained civil servant who made an administrative error born of ignorance, not malice. Prosecutor Bradley Harrison had dismantled that defense with surgical precision, playing the security footage of Rick laughing, bending the passport, and physically lunging at the courier. He presented the deposition of Brenda Hayes, which chronicled Rick's long-documented history of racially profiling young minority travelers to satisfy his own power complex. Finally, Harrison submitted a classified, redacted affidavit from the Pentagon detailing the injuries sustained by the operative in Eastern Europe, injuries directly linked to the operational delay caused by Rick's actions. Judge Theodore Whitmore, a federal judge known for his zero-tolerance policy regarding abuses of authority, leaned forward over the heavy mahogany bench. He looked down at Rick with a gaze that could have frozen boiling water. "Mr. Gable," Judge Whitmore's voice boomed through the quiet courtroom, "you were entrusted with a position that serves as the first line of defense for the traveling public. Instead of executing your duties with professionalism and respect, you weaponized your meager authority to humiliate a young man you deemed beneath you. You profiled him. You mocked him. And in your staggering, willful ignorance, you illegally seized a Tier 1 national security credential, triggering a chain of events that compromised a highly classified, time-sensitive military operation." Rick stared at the floor, his shoulders trembling as silent sobs racked his body. "You believed that wearing a badge shielded you from consequence," the judge continued, his voice rising in volume. "You believed that you were untouchable. Let this court's ruling serve as a definitive correction to that dangerous delusion. For the charges of violating the Espionage Act by reckless endangerment and the assault of a federal operative, I sentence you to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, to be served consecutively, without the possibility of parole." The strike of the judge's gavel sounded like a gunshot. Rick's knees buckled as the U.S. Marshals grabbed him by the arms, practically dragging him out of the courtroom to begin a decade and a half of hard time. Back at JFK Terminal 4, the atmosphere at Checkpoint Charlie had fundamentally changed. Brenda Hayes had been promoted to head checkpoint manager. She had immediately implemented a strict, mandatory training program focused on implicit bias and high-level credential recognition. It was informally known among the staff as the Gable Protocol. The days of arrogant officers using the podium as a personal bullying pulpit were over. The memory of the FBI SWAT team storming the terminal remained a fresh, highly effective deterrent. 1,000 miles away, inside the bustling departure hall of Washington Dulles International Airport, 19-year-old David Sterling walked quietly toward a security checkpoint. He wore an unassuming navy blue jacket and carried the exact same heavy black canvas duffel bag over his shoulder. As he approached the document-checking podium, a TSA officer, a young man with a respectful demeanor, asked for his ID. David reached into his jacket and slid the matte black Department of Defense credential across the stainless steel surface. The officer looked at the cover, his eyes widening slightly in recognition of the seal. He didn't laugh. He didn't sneer. He immediately stood a little straighter, carefully picked up the booklet, and scanned the barcode. The monitor flashed a bright, secure green, "Everything is in order, sir," the officer said, handing the credential back with a polite nod. "Have a safe flight, and thank you for your service." David offered a faint, imperceptible smile. "Thank you, officer." He slipped the passport back into his jacket, adjusted the strap of his heavy bag, and walked seamlessly through the checkpoint, disappearing into the crowd, a quiet ghost moving freely through a system that had finally learned to respect the unseen weight he carried. The story of Richard Gable is a visceral, satisfying reminder that karma is absolutely real, and it often arrives wearing a federal windbreaker. What started as an arrogant attempt to publicly humiliate a quiet black teenager transformed into a catastrophic lesson on the dangers of racial profiling, unchecked ego, and abusing a tiny sliver of authority. Gable thought he was playing the role of the big-shot enforcer. Instead, he unknowingly tripped a national security wire that wiped out his career, his freedom, and his future in a matter of minutes. He became a living cautionary tale of what happens when a bully picks a fight with the wrong target. If you loved seeing this arrogant TSA officer get hit with the ultimate career-ending reality check, smash that like button right now. Share this video to remind people that kindness and professionalism are always better than an ego trip. And make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're the first to hear our next unbelievable story of instant karma and real-world justice.